We decided to do the only interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. conducted in the last 15 years that doesn't mention vaccines. But if you're interested in why we have found ourselves at war with Russia, or who killed his uncle, President Kennedy, and why, it's worth watching. Bobby Kennedy Jr., thank you for joining us. So I noticed when you showed up, you've been on the road for weeks, you had no Secret Service with you, which is a little weird given that your father was murdered while running for president, as you now are. Why wouldn't you have Secret Service protection?
Well, I did do a tweet on that got 30 million views when we got rejected. We applied in May for Secret Service protection. Secret Service protection was only allocated to the nominees of the parties prior to 1968. But when my father was killed, they changed the law immediately, and all of the people who were running against him, including George Wallace, immediately got Secret Service protection. So the law says that you're entitled to Secret Service protection automatically 100 days out. But the president also has discretion to give Secret Service protection to any candidate for any reason. And there are criteria, which is that you have to have 15% of polling results for a limited period of time. But he even can overrule that. For example, President Obama was given Secret Service protection 441 days out, or 551 days out, even though he had only, I think, 5% support at that time. My Uncle Teddy was given Secret Service protection 450 days out, even though he had not even declared for his presidency. And so he and Carter hated each other. President Carter was, the president of his own party, and Teddy had been enormously critical of him. And personally, they had a very personal antipathy for one another. And Teddy ended up running against him. But when he was moving into that decision to run, Carter, in a very classy move, gave him Secret Service protection. We applied for it. I get a lot of threats, a lot of death threats, and I get, a lot of people who are, for example, about 2 weeks ago, a mentally ill person made it to the second story of my house, and that is a very, very common occurrence.
Inside your house?
Yeah, inside my house. Before, somebody who was working there stopped them and then called the police. And we gave the Secret Service a 67, in fact, Gavin DeBecker, who you've had on this show,
yes,
who's runs the premier security service in the world, put together a 67-page report, which included 28 pages of all the threats, of typical threats against me, and other indicia that I should have Secret Service protection. And I assumed the president would give it to me because, it just seems like bad judgment not to give it to me. If you go even on my Twitter feed, probably one out of, every 30 or 40 comments says, oh, you're going to get killed or something like that. It takes notice of the peculiar threats to my family, family members who are in this business. So it's something that, the average American is aware of.
Yeah, your name is Robert F. Kennedy.
Yeah. And so it was an odd decision. I got a letter. Gavin actually got the letter because he'd been doing, and by the way, I want to say this, the Secret Service themselves were wonderful. They were very, very encouraging, and they were very helpful at every step along the way. And I believe, and I can't speak for them, but I believe that their assumption was that we were going to get Secret Service protection. In fact, they told Gavin, we're going to send somebody out there within 10 days to interview Cheryl and Bobby and to tell them what it's going to look like. Because there's a lot of questions about, do I go to the gym? Do I have them, all of these questions that I don't know the answers to. And they come and they have a standard process for informing you. But then they went dark. And they said, a decision is made very quickly within 14 days, is what they told us. And they said, we have 8 details standing by ready to go, so we can do this very quickly. And then they went dark, and for 88 days, we didn't hear from them. And then I got the letter from Mayorkas, Alexander Mayorkas, who's the director of DHS, saying that we've determined that you don't need Secret Service protection.
But it's very obvious, and you've confirmed it, that there are threats against your life, against your family. That's known. And so if they deny you protection, and they know that, what message are they sending?
I don't really know what they're doing. And by the way, you know, we've looked, and there's a guy called Jeremy Hammond who's done a really good article, a really thorough article about the past. And he was not able, and we were not able to find a single presidential candidate who had requested protection from the president and was not given protection. You know, Herman Cain got it, I think, 500 days out. Jesse Jackson, Shirley Chisholm, George Bush, and Ronald Reagan got it something 500 or 600 days out when they first ran. So it's just standard operating procedure. And particularly people who are polling around anywhere over 15%, which I have been for 4 or 5 months now, are, you know, regarded as, it's been treated as pro forma. And I am the outlier. I'm the single outliner that we could find that was denied Secret Service protection.
Why do you think that is?
I think, I think the DNC is playing hardball. And let's say this, I think the least malevolent interpretation that you can put on it is that they know that I'm going to have some kind of security service. And that typically would cost me, to do real security service between $100,000 and $200,000 a month. Because you have to pay the protectors, you have to pay for their transportation,
of course,
you have
hotels,
to pay for the cars, and the hotels, the foods, and all of this, and it's very expensive because I'm traveling every day. So I think they probably feel like they can bleed me white by, and making sure that I'm not spending that money on advertising or organization, but that I have to raise a lot of money for my own protection. But I don't know. I mean, I'm just speculating about that.
Does it strike you that the Biden administration pays for personal security for Zelensky, but not for you?
No, well, listen, John Bolton still has a Secret Service detail.
Still?
Yeah, still. He hasn't been in government in years.
And he didn't do a good job in government.
All the president's family have Secret Service details. Hunter has a Secret Service detail. When he goes to court every day, he has 4 or 5 cars that are coming with him in a very, very big detail. So, and many government officials who are ex-government officials, what the Secret Service told us, and you can go to look at Jeremy Hammond's report, which you can find on, I think you just go on the internet and put Jeremy Hammond and RFK Secret Service. He shows that literally nobody, no presidential candidate, many other people are receiving it, but I'm really like an outlier.
So that raises the larger. You're running against Biden, right? So obviously you're not on his Christmas card list anymore, but it does raise the bigger question: why do people in Washington have this, and not just in government but also in media, have this kind of special loathing for you, this hatred of you?
I don't know that. I cannot answer that question. I'm shocked, even though, I've been, I'd say maligned for many years because of the stuff that I was doing with vaccines. The kind of the uniformity of the vitriol against me in the mainstream media and the dishonesty of it, that, virtually every article contains not just mischaracterizations, but also just outright lies, things that any fact checker could look up and determine were not true. And they all are doing it, whether it's Vanity Fair or whether it's the Atlantic Monthly or Washington Post, Boston Globe, there's virtually no exception.
What do you think your crime is?
I think part of it is that there's been, and again, I don't know, I can't explain it. Somebody else, I know somebody will explain it in a way at one point where I'll go, that makes sense. But right now, what it seems to me is that there's been this alignment, this political alignment that I think really started with Fox News back, when Roger was running things there, where he overtly made it a political network. He aligned it with the Republican Party, and he said, we're going to push their agenda. And up until then, that has been considered a journalistic ethical breach. The networks were supposed to at least pretend neutrality. And the newspapers as well. But now I think that business model works so well for Fox, and again, that I think MSNBC and CNN adopted the same business model. And then there's been this big consolidation in the media, where there really is no independent media. You have every newspaper in this country, every radio station, every TV station, almost all the billboards and most of the large internet content providers that are now owned by 5 companies. That was illegal under the 1928 Communication of the Radio Act. Today, it's been that has been what's happened. We've had this big consolidation, and I think the profit models for Wall Street, which now it's BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, which own them all, and they have to. The news divisions have become business models. Business profit centers, and they've aligned themselves. They've figured out that their strategy is to align themselves with the DNC or the RNC. That's the only thing that's the best explanation, and it's probably not a very good one, but
and you're in the way of the DNC.
There is this weird uniformity.
But its effect is to ignore stories that are objectively the most important stories. I mean, wherever you fall on those questions, there's no denying that the war in Ukraine is changing the world. It will change history. Most of the stuff is a footnote. That's a book, and yet the coverage of it is not even. Yeah. So, for example, the president.
That's much more consequential.
Well, it's the most consequential,
ultimately,
but it's
and the coverage of me, which is there's no questioning of these orthodoxies. And when it comes to the Ukraine war, I mean, we're being lied to about it.
In what way?
Well, I mean, we were lied to from the beginning. We had this comic book depiction which we see on every war. There's a bad guy who's unspeakably evil.
Yes.
Who's planning world conquest or a terrorist attack on America. And we have to be the good guys and go in and stop it. And, the background of the Ukraine war is much more complex than that. The U.S. has been involved, and particularly the neocons in the White House. I wouldn't say particularly, I'd say a group of people that are known as neocons since 2001 have been talking about putting NATO in Ukraine. Now, and I'll give you the background. In 1992, the walls came down and the Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev went to Tony Blair and to President Bush, who were the UK and US presidents at that time, and said, I'm going to do something extraordinary that basically is going to have the rest of Russian history branding me as a traitor to my country. I'm going to withdraw 400,000 Soviet troops from East Germany, and I'm going to allow you to reunify Germany under NATO troops. So you're going to move NATO troops, a hostile force, into our barracks and our bases. I'm going to do that. And the only commitment I want from you is that once I allow Germany to reunify, to become part of NATO, that you will never move NATO further to the east, because we're going to now release all of these Soviet states that were part of the Soviet Union. They're going to become independent states, and we don't want NATO moving into those. And James Baker, who was the Secretary of State at that time, famously said, we promise that we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. So Gorbachev now did that, and he's now, despised in Russia. And then in 1996 and 1997, so 5 years later, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the first kind of the father of the neocon movement. The neocons represent in a sentence is that they were a group of people who believed, and Donald Rumsfeld and Jonathan Yu and Paul Wolfowitz, Robert Kagan, Victoria Nuland, who's now at the top State Department official, their belief was that the U.S. had won the Cold War, and that victory gave us the privilege of dominating the world using our superior military unipower status and our superior military status for the next century. So their principal blueprint document is called Project for a New American Century. In other words, America would own the 21st century. So Brzezinski says, okay, we should start this process by moving NATO into all the former satellite states. Well, and this was in 1997. At that time, George Kennan was still around. Now, George Kennan, as you know, was the principal architect of the Cold War containment policy. He's arguably the most important, most respected diplomat and statesman in American history. Oh, he said, if you do that, you are going to provoke a violent response from Russia. They cannot live with NATO on their borders. They cannot, any more than we would live with a Soviet alliance in Mexico and Canada. At that time, Bill Perry was Clinton's Secretary of State, and Bill Perry said, if you do this, if you go forward with this plan, I'm going to resign because it's so foolhardy. You are forcing Russia into a violent military response. And the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union at that time, who is now the head of the CIA, said the same thing. It's the worst mistake America can make to move NATO to the east. So we went ahead and did it. We moved it not 1 inch, but 1,000 miles, 14 countries, and then we put nuclear-ready missile launchers, Aegis missile systems, which are made by Lockheed and can take Tomahawk missiles 12 minutes from Moscow. We could, in 12 minutes, decapitate the entire leadership of Russia. And we put those in Poland and Romania. And we then tried to move it into NATO into Ukraine. So you remember when my uncle, when Russia put missile systems, nuclear missile systems in Cuba, and my uncle would have had to invade, he was able, the reason Russia put them there then is because we had put nukes, Jupiter missiles, in Turkey and Italy. My uncle and father made a secret deal with Ambassador Dobrynin, where they said to him, look, we understand you're angry. You cannot live with Jupiter missiles in Turkey. That's why you put your missiles in Cuba. If you remove your missiles from Cuba within 6 months, we will remove ours from Turkey. But nobody says what the deal was. And that's what happened. So now we're back, and we've again put nuclear-ready missile systems along right next to Russia. And now we want to go do the one thing that Russia has said, and Putin said again and again and again, this is a red line. Before Putin, the Russian leadership was saying it is a red line. You cannot go into Ukraine. The Russians have been invaded 3 times from you. Our country's never been invaded. The Russians were invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time they were invaded, Hitler killed between 20 and 40 million Russians. Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. In my uncle's speech to his most famous speech in American University in 1963, in July of 1963, he said to the American people, he said, we're all taught we won World War II, but we didn't win World War II. The Russians won it. And the sacrifice they made to destroy Hitler was beyond anything Americans can imagine. He was trying to tell the American people, you have to put ourselves in their position and understand what they're doing. And he said, a third of the country was leveled. Every city, the forests burned, the cities were leveled, the forests and fields burned, Imagine if that happened from the coast, the east coast of the United States, to every city, forest, and field from here to Chicago. That's what the Russians put up with. So we have to understand this, that Ukraine is a red line. The invasion came through Ukraine, and they can't live with it. It's a security issue for them that is almost beyond our comprehension. And so, we've had...
But so that suggests the point is war with Russia.
The point was war with Russia. And in fact, the neocons said that again and again, and Biden, when he was and let me get back to that, okay, because that is absolutely true. The Biden, was first of all, in 2014, to go through the modern history, 2014, there are riots it's called the Maidan Rebellion in Ukraine, which we're not told that we are financing those riots. The newspapers never told us, our government never told us. USAID, which is a CIA front, put $5 billion into funding those riots. Those riots lead to a coup d'etat against the first democratically elected government of the Ukraine. It was a government that refused to choose sides and to say we're going to be on the side of the West. So we wanted them out. A month before that government is overthrown, Victoria Nuland, who's the part of the centerpiece of the neocon ideology and who is now a high-level official in the State Department, has a secret call with the U.S. ambassador, which is tape recorded and is now public, which anybody can go and look up, where she is picking the new cabinet for Ukraine, which is which is a U.S. Western cabinet. So they're picking the new government a month before the old government is overthrown.
Is that how democracy? Is that democracy when Victoria Nuland picks her government?
Well, that's the point. Is USAID doesn't really do, and the CIA don't do democracy. The CIA has overthrown, I think, 83 governments between 1947 and 1997. That's a third of the governments on Earth, and most of them were democracies. Oh, it doesn't do democracy. It does coup d'etats. So then, to put the rest of this history, and we put in a Western government. Everybody says, well, the Russians started this by invading Crimea. But put yourself in Putin's position. And I'm not an apologist for Putin, by the way. He went into Ukraine. It was illegal. My son went over there and fought against it, and risked his life in the Kharkiv rebellion. I'm not making excuses for him. What he did was brutal. It was illegal and it was unnecessary. But we have to understand our role in the provocations. And so if you're in Putin's position, now you're looking at Ukraine, and Ukraine is being run by a pro-U.S. government. What's the first thing he thinks? They're going to take Vladivostok, which is the port in the Crimea on the Black Sea, which has been a Russian port, their only warm water port for 347 years. It's where the Russian Navy is, their sub base, it's everything else. And he says, now this new government is going to invite the U.S. Navy in to take over our facilities. We got to go in there and take it back. So he goes into Crimea. He goes in and takes Crimea without firing a shot or killing a single person. The Crimean population is largely Russian, and they welcome the invasion. So, again, I'm not making excuses for him, but I'm saying we have to understand. My uncle always said we have to understand the position of our adversaries, and what forces are they dealing with. So then then the Russians now there's as soon as we put in that new government, the first rule they pass is to make the Russian language essentially illegal in Donbass and Lugansk, where 90% of the population are Russian. And there's then peaceful uprising, which people begin dying. They turn violent. Now, which side made them violent is a dispute. But it's not a dispute that the Russians were now being treated. The ethnic Russian population in Ukraine is now being treated like red-headed stepchildren. They're not, they're being slapped around and they're being abused and they're not being allowed to practice their culture or their language. And so there's a vote then in Donbass and Lugansk where they vote 90-10 to join Russia. Russia says no. Putin says no, I don't want you, but let's sign an agreement that protects you. So they put together an agreement with France, Germany, and Russia called the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords say leave Donbass and Lugansk as part of Ukraine, but make them semi-autonomous so they can speak their own language, and so the Russians who live there are going to be protected from violence by the government. And the Russian parliament or the Ukrainian parliament won't ratify the Minsk Accords, but France agreed to it, Germany agreed to it, and Putin agreed to it. So then Zelensky runs in 2019. Zelensky is a comedian and he's an actor. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory way because my wife is a comedian and actor, but I'm saying it because here's a guy with no political background who wins the election with 90% of the vote. Why did he win the election? He won the election because he ran on a peace platform. He ran promising that he would sign the Minsk Accords. He gets into office. The minute he gets there and he's told everybody, I'm going to sign the Minsk Accords and settle the peace with Russia, he suddenly pivots. And we don't know what happened, but the rational assumption is that the U.S. government told him he could not do that. So the Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken and Avril Haines, who's the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, told him you cannot have a peace with Russia. Plus, people within, ultranationalists within Ukraine told him if you sign that, we're going to kill you. And a lot of people say, anyway, they threatened him with death, and that is pretty well documented. Then Russia invades. But Russia only invades, and so we say, oh, look, Putin is trying to take over Europe. But they only send in 40,000 troops. I think there's 3.5 million people in Kiev, so they clearly did not want to take the country. He clearly wanted to bring people to the negotiating table. He did not send in enough troops to take all of Ukraine. So then Zelensky comes to the negotiating tables, and we now know this, and this is recent information. In March of 2022, Zelensky and Putin agree on a peace agreement that's based upon the Minsk Accords. It's like Minsk Accords 2.0. And Zelensky initials it, the Russians initial it, and Russia begins withdrawing its troops from Ukraine. And what happens? President Biden sends Boris Johnson over there to torpedo the agreement and make Zelensky tear it up. And then we go to war. 350,000 Ukrainian kids are now dead, and 40 or 50,000 Russians. So and that month, April is when they signed it in March. April, Boris Johnson was sent over there to torpedo it, and that month, Lloyd Austin, who is the Secretary of Defense under Biden, is asked, why are we at war in Ukraine? And he said, our purpose in this war is to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. So that is not what they're telling us.
But do they?
And Biden that month says, when he's asked about the war in Ukraine, he says, our purpose is regime change in Russia. So again, that has nothing to do with Ukraine. What that means is the Ukraine is a proxy in essentially a struggle between two superpowers, between Russia and the United States. And, we've now committed $113 billion over there. And just to put that in perspective, the total budget of EPA is $12 billion. The total budget of the CDC is $12 billion. We're sending $113 billion over. When Mitch McConnell was asked, how can we do this? When you're cutting food stamps and cutting Medicare, cutting food stamps to 30 million Americans, cutting Medicare to 15 million Americans, they're not going to have any health insurance. how can we send 113 billion over there? If we had that 113 billion here, we wouldn't have had to cut one food stamp payment.